because the government takes more of an interest in Bitcoin itself. They might want to transfer, right, the things that they're doing on the traditional system to Bitcoin. If I had a Bitcoin address and somebody knew my Bitcoin address and they were a sanctioned entity, they could just send me Bitcoin and then I would be subject to sanctions.
Compliant mining is just not feasible. It's too hard. Suppose a non-compliant block comes out with a blacklisted Bitcoin transaction. I see it and I promise to rewrite it. So what do? Instead of mining a block that points to that one, I mine a block that points to the previous block. Then my block appears at that block height, and the non-compliant block is lost to history. Along with the block reward, I get the reward instead.
Like any government could just decide, hey, we want to implement sanctions on Bitcoin also, right?
Hi, everyone. I'm Renee Sorchik, the VP of Research at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, and today I'm here with Dr. Craig Warmke, an Associate Professor of Philosophy at Northern Illinois University, and Dr. Joshua Hendrickson, a Professor of Economics and the Chair of the Economics Department at University of Mississippi, to discuss their latest paper, Sanctions and Sanction-Resistant Money. So this paper goes over U.S. economic sanctions and how they rely on financial intermediaries. But because Bitcoin is decentralized and censorship resistant, it makes it a little bit more challenging to enforce mechanisms such as sanctions. So while sanctioning Bitcoin transactions might actually be feasible, either on chain or looking at what goes into blocks, such things are largely ineffective, or so they posit in their paper. So welcome, gentlemen. Thank you, both of you, for joining me. And maybe if we could get started just kind of laying the groundwork of why does the US dollar payment, why do the rails of this system, why do they have such extraordinary leverage over the whole global financial system? And how does that make sanctions an effective tool for implementing the US policies agenda of the US? So maybe we'll start with you, Josh, if you want to kind of lay the groundwork here.
So really what this boils down to is kind of the center of the global financial system is the US dollar. So, the majority of trade gets done in dollars, even when, the United States or other countries that use dollars aren't involved. And even all the payment processing that's taking place on these international payment rails, it kind of flows through the United States. And so because of that, the United States is kind of in this unique position where it can use its sort of the powers within its jurisdiction, right, to put restrictions on certain people or entities and prevent certain transactions from taking place in the traditional financial system, just because so much of those transactions are in terms of dollars, and so much of that is flowing through payment rails that the U.S. government has jurisdiction over.
There might be several modalities you could do that, so several pressure points. So you mentioned miners, nodes, and developers. So Craig, do you want to tell us why you think miners might be the most viable target for enforcing sanctions?
Sure. So when the United States sanctions an entity, they put them on through the Office of Foreign Assets Control, put them on the specially designated nationals list. That's our blacklist. And when that happens, two kinds of financial censorship come into play. There's one kind which you can think of as soft censorship. Just ordinary individuals and businesses shouldn't transact with entities on the list. So if one of my friends gets on the blacklist, I'm not sending or receiving any money through PayPal or anything else. This financially isolates people by transacting with others and other businesses. But there's also a stronger form of censorship that comes into play, which is that financial intermediaries aren't supposed to transact on someone's behalf. So if I'm blacklisted, no bank should send money to another business or individual on my behalf. So whereas this kind of soft censorship has to do with not transacting with blacklisted individuals, it's the strong censorship that has to do with not transacting for blacklisted individuals. Now, the SDN list, the blacklist, it has a bunch of Bitcoin addresses. And so miners can trivially see whether a transaction that's in the mempool has such a blacklisted address, and then they can decide whether or not they when they're in the mining competition, whether or not the blocks they're trying to build would include such a blacklisted address. So in that way, Bitcoin miners are the closest thing in the Bitcoin network that operate like banks and other trusted financial intermediaries in the traditional financial world, who are subject to following laws and regulations about not dealing with blacklisted individuals and entities.
And let's say you were trying to explain to Elizabeth Warren why trying to sanction through nodes might not work or might not be the most feasible way.
Yeah, so what does a node actually do? So one thing a node does is that it verifies like the syntax of a Bitcoin transaction, and that's just it's like being they're serving as filters in a way. They're filtering out ill-formed transactions that might attempt to spend Bitcoin that's already been spent. And so they're not serving as in any way as any kind of financial intermediary. There are no funds that go through nodes. Another thing that nodes do is that they cultivate their own individual copies of the chain of blocks or the blockchain. And so they keep a record of all past Bitcoin transactions. Again, there are no funds channeled through either of these processes. And so if you want to leverage any kind of power to prevent blacklisted individuals from transacting, nodes probably aren't the right way to do it. And they also, they're also, so you might also think that software developers could, kind of embed filters in, OFAC filters into the Bitcoin protocol. This would need to be updated, but you can't make people run the software. So for all kinds of sociological reasons and technical reasons, neither nodes or developers, I think, are the proper pressure points. And now when I say that, I don't mean, I'm in favor of our sanctions regime and this is how we should do it. I'm putting on my cap as like an OFAC official and wanting to think through whether and to what extent the old sanctions regime actually fits at all with Bitcoin. And it doesn't fit at all with trying to enforce any kind of behavior from node runners or software developers.
So, Josh, maybe the question for you, how realistic is it to imagine that US-based miners could enforce OFAC rules, especially when Bitcoin is a global decentralized network?
Well, I think there's a couple of ways to think about this. I think first and foremost, as the government takes more of an interest in Bitcoin itself, they might want to transfer, right, the things that they're doing on the traditional system to Bitcoin. And I do think, miners are a pressure point here, in part because if you're like mining at home or something like that, it would be very, very difficult potentially to make you comply. But if you're like a big publicly traded miner, or if you're just a big company that the government is aware of, whose business is mining, you're naturally going to become a target for those people. But the other thing is that, even for individual miners, like, it's not riskless to go against the government if they try to enforce these OFAC sanctions on Bitcoin, right? Like, there's always a chance that you get caught somehow, right? And so, but the question is, what's the probability that you get caught, which is probably pretty low, but then what's the cost? And if the cost is really, really high, even if the probability is low, you might be, you might comply just because you're sort of nervous that they'll find you, right? So, the kind of the thing here is that they already have this regime. They like this regime. This is the primary tool of American foreign policy, really since the Obama administration. And so, the United States has jurisdiction over anybody who's mining, in the United States. So if they enact particular policies, they can at least legally require people to behave in certain ways. But then, of course, the question is, as a practical matter, can they really do this? It might be easy to lean on, publicly traded companies because everybody knows who they are, and it shouldn't be difficult to identify if they're in compliance or not. But like I said, if you're just a home miner, how are they going to find you and see and check your filters or something? It's going to be very difficult. Not to say that they wouldn't find ways to do that, but also the reason that we should take this seriously is that there are actual people out there who, are proposing, like, hey, maybe we should have certain types of sanctions on Bitcoin. So maybe, we should not allow people to transact with particular Bitcoin addresses. But, when it comes to miners, it could be, okay, it's not just that you can't transact with certain addresses. If it comes to miners, like, you can't allow transactions associated with this address into the block. And these are actual things that people have proposed. And so it's not unreasonable to think that the United States might not try to carry over these restrictions into Bitcoin. The main question, though, is that if they were to do that, can they actually redo it? Can they actually do it? Right. So, hence the title of the paper, right, is like Sanctions and Sanction-Resistant Money. So the selling point of Bitcoin is that it's censorship resistant. And so sort of the question that we're asking is, given that people are already proposing trying to implement, similar sanctions using the Bitcoin network, is it truly censorship resistant, and can it withstand the might of the U.S. government?
And I mean, there's already been some pressure, right? So maybe you'd like to talk about Marathon Digital's experience and their attempt to mine OFAC-compliant blocks and kind of how that went and what happened.
Sure. So in March of 2021, Marathon, one of the largest domestic miners, who also runs their own mining pool, said that they would adopt a compliant mining strategy where they would not include blacklisted Bitcoin addresses in any of the transactions of their own blocks. This met with some backlash, of course, especially in early May of 2021, when they advertised that they mined their first compliant block. So two things happened in the wake of this announcement. One is that it looked like that very block contained some transactions for a kind of dark market called Hydra. And two, anytime a miner mines a block, they receive Bitcoin at what's called a coin-based transaction. That's a transaction that gives them a reward from the block subsidy and the fees. And that Bitcoin address at which they received the reward and the fees is public. And so anyone else can send that Coinbase address more Bitcoin. And in just a few blocks later, someone put in a memo in Persian, thanks for helping our cause. And so people then started to say on social media and in some like crypto-centric journalistic outlets that this was a transaction initiated by individuals in Iran, which we've sanctioned. So not only did the block include transactions from a dark market, but the Coinbase address later received Bitcoin from presumably sanctioned individuals. Now, the lesson that many people drew from this episode is that compliant mining is just not feasible. It's too hard. But when you look more closely at the details, I think that lesson was totally wrong. So first, the transactions involving Hydra, none of those Bitcoin addresses from Hydra had already been sanctioned. And Hydra doesn't get sanctioned through OFAC until a year later. And then two, Bitcoin is a push network, not a pull network. So this is a distinction in payment networks. Like credit cards work on pull networks. So when you insert your card with the vendor at like Starbucks, they initiate a transaction to pull money from your account. You're not pushing money, they're pulling it from you. But with Bitcoin, the sender has the ability to push money. And of course, if the sender has the power to push money, the recipients are basically powerless to prevent the money from just appearing within your address. So it turns out that there had already been, guidelines offered down from OFAC and other regulatory agencies about what to do when someone receives money on push networks from sanctioned individuals. And these are requirements that concern, reporting that you've received it and then blocking those funds. And in Bitcoin, both of those things are completely trivial. You can just pick up the phone, excuse me, hello, I received some money from a sanctioned individual, check. And then two, I guess I just won't spend that money anymore. I'll just let that UTXO sit forever unless the government tells me it's okay. Check. So in neither of these cases, validating transactions and including the blocks from Hydra, and then two, receiving money from presumably individuals in Iran. In neither of these cases did Marathon actually fail in its efforts to produce a clean block. They did about as good as one could. And that's what we would expect, because filtering is trivial. When you're thinking about email or cell phones and mobile networks, when it only concerns your own device, just put in the cellular address, just put in the email address to block messages and phone calls from those places. Done. And the same is true for Bitcoin mining when it concerns the blocks that you mine. As long as you have this filter that filters out blacklisted addresses, it's trivial to mine blocks without those addresses. It's very easy. And so the lesson that people drew, compliant mining is impossible or really difficult, is not the right lesson. The right lesson is actually this is feasible. you can do it when it concerns your own blocks, your own email account, your own cell phone. What makes Bitcoin different is that there's a competitive network of miners. And so just because I mine a compliant block doesn't mean someone else won't later.
Josh, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that basically there's two fundamental issues here. Like, one is kind of what Craig was speaking to, which is like the feasibility of just doing these things. And then, so like feasibility is one thing, and then sort of effectiveness is another thing, right? And so, in terms of feasibility, it's entirely feasible that you could tell people, hey, don't transact with these addresses, and then they just filter those addresses and they don't try to mine them. But that's a separate question of whether that would be effective, right? Because as long as there's somebody out there who's willing to include those transactions into the block, well, then in that case, like eventually that transaction is going to find its way into a block. And so in that case, even though it's feasible, it might not necessarily be effective, right? And now you could argue that maybe the objective is really just to increase the costs to these sanctioned entities, because you're going to force them to pay higher fees or something like that, and so you're imposing this cost on them. But I mean, that's kind of the fundamental thing, though, is like, I think once you start thinking about OFAC compliance, you start thinking about how Bitcoin really works, because Bitcoin works in a very different way than the traditional financial system. So, for example, we have secondary sanctions in the U.S. where, yeah, the United States might list specific people who are sanctioned, but then there are sanctions for people who do business with those people. So if you're actually processing transactions from a particular entity who's on the sanctions list, well, now you're subject to sanctions. And again, like, that's hard to think about on Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is pushing transactions through the system, right? So anybody could technically send, if I had a Bitcoin address and somebody knew my Bitcoin address and they were a sanctioned entity, they could just send me Bitcoin. And then I would be subject to sanctions, but I can't actually deny that transaction, right? That's not how the system works. And so it's just very different to think about how this would work on Bitcoin versus the traditional financial system, right? In the traditional financial system, whether or not I want to be involved, I mean, typically what we're talking about are banks. We're talking about intermediaries, right? We're typically talking about a bank who's transferring money from a sanctioned entity to someone else, or from someone else to a sanctioned entity, or even between two sanctioned entities. And but in that case, like, though, somebody is like willfully taking part in these transactions that they know are subject to these sanctions. Whereas on Bitcoin, it's not the same thing. If anyone can send me Bitcoin, right? Anybody can just send it to me if they know my address, even a sanctioned person, and there's nothing I can do about that. Even if I wanted to deny that person's ability to do it, they can still send it.
And maybe you also want to mention about the fees. If a sanctioned entity wanted to get their block or their transaction in the block, and they got willing to pay higher fees, and it drives the fees up, but that means miners overseas are making more and getting more fees. So do you want to touch on the competitiveness of, how does that affect you as miners, and what would happen in that scenario?
Yeah. So if you're thinking about this, it's a competitive market for mining. And so if I want my transaction process faster, I just have to offer higher fees than everybody else, right? As long as I'm willing to pay a higher fee for the transaction, that's going to make my transaction more attractive to miners. And so even if the United States could get everybody in the United States to comply with like their sanctions, nobody outside of U.S. jurisdiction would have to honor those rules. They're not subject to the laws of the United States. And so in that case, essentially what you could have is you could just have miners elsewhere earning all of these high fees because they're allowed to accept these transactions, and like U.S. miners are not. And so even if you were successful, what you would be doing is you would just be transferring to people who are processing these transactions who are outside of your jurisdiction, because the sanctioned entity is just paying more to get the transaction processed, right? Or paying more to get it processed, faster.
Right. So I think that we've outlined pretty clearly that, trying to do sanctioning through what's included in blocks is technically feasible, but ineffective. So Craig, you guys also mentioned there's another modality that might be possible, and you term it a feather fork. So maybe you want to outline what that is and how does it change the incentives for miners to include or maybe exclude some of these sanctioned transactions?
Back in the early history of Bitcoin, on the Bitcoin talk forums, a cybersecurity researcher who's now a professor at the University of Illinois named Andrew Miller coined this term feather fork for what I'm about to describe. So it's a way for something like the U.S. government or some other kind of powerful governmental entity. It doesn't have to be a government. Just someone who has enough hash rate to deploy this kind of strategy. And the important thing is that you don't need 51% of hash rate in order to pull it off. You can pull it off with much less if the scenario is right. So suppose I have, say, 10% of hash rate, 10% of hash rate, and I credibly announce, not only am I not going to mine any blocks with blacklisted Bitcoin blacklisted addresses in the transactions, I'm also going to attempt to rewrite any block that does. Now, if you're another miner on the network outside of my 10% of hash rate, that upsets the expected value calculus for how much you expect to receive from mining blocks with blacklisted transactions. Because now they're suddenly worth less. Why? Because they're subject to the risk of being rewritten. And as a result, if they are rewritten, you would lose the block reward that you had gained with the block. And the amount that you're discounted, the amount that you have to discount any such block is proportional to how much hash rate I have as the lead of this what we call chain compliance strategy, of this feather fork strategy. So if the discount is big enough, then it makes sense for other miners just to mine compliant blocks with me also. And then you're in a cascade. Now the people who are mining compliant blocks and are greater and greater proportion of the network, and I can accomplish this just through words, credible words. I promise to rewrite any block with any blacklisted Bitcoin address. So that's the strategy.
So how could they actually rewrite the block?
Sure. So every Bitcoin block points to a previous block. That's what makes them a chain. And so suppose a non-compliant block comes out with a blacklisted Bitcoin transaction. I see it and I promise to rewrite it. So what do? Instead of mining a block that points to that one, I mine a block that points to the previous block. And insofar as another block appears on top of mine, and then my block later appears in the heaviest chain, the chain that is judged probabilistically to have enjoyed the most hash rate behind it, then my block appears at that block height, and the non-compliant block is lost to history. Along with the block reward, I get the reward instead.
Assuming you have enough like other fellow compliant miners that you're not, splitting and doing all that stuff. So, okay. So Josh, is this something we should be worried about? Why or why not?
I think this is something that is more, this is something to take more seriously than some of the other easier sounding things. So because a lot of the stuff of just like, let's take OFAC and let's just transfer it to Bitcoin, like it just doesn't really work. And it doesn't take, and anybody who understands Bitcoin, it's very easy to start seeing, well, that doesn't really translate to Bitcoin. Like that's more something that goes in the traditional financial system. But with this sort of thing, if you could if you could try to implement this, like it does create a problem, because it creates a problem because it's different than a sort of 51% attack. But it's essentially what you're introducing is you're introducing something new to kind of the mining process that miners have to take into consideration, which is that if they're not paying attention to sanctioned addresses and they're just processing anything, there's always some chance that those people have their block reward wiped away. And that changes the profitability from mining, right? Because even if, even if this isn't a very successful strategy, even if it's just occasionally successful that there are people out there rewriting these blocks, it's going to change expected profitability from mining. And to the extent that it changes the expected profitability, that's going to affect how much hash power you're going to use on the network. That's going to affect your incentive. It might also affect your incentives about what transactions to process. Like it might force you to say, well, actually, I want to move to the group that's only processing the other transactions, so I never am at risk of losing out. But there's lots of moving parts here, right? Because it depends on how many people are in each group, how many people are actually trying to rewrite blocks, how many are not trying to rewrite blocks. All of that is going to matter, but also lots of other things are going to matter. Like there are lots of other things that affect profitability. So somebody who's in an area where electricity is really cheap, for example, they're going to care a lot less about this than somebody who's in an area where, they're barely profitable in mining because electricity costs are much higher. And so there are all these moving parts to try to disentangle these things. And so one of the things that we do in the paper is we just develop a sort of we just sort of develop this game theoretic model where you've got two types of miners, one that's willing to rewrite the chain and one that's not. And then when you do that, you can kind of see how these different interactions between of profitability can actually affect behavior. And this strategy of actually going out and having people rewriting blocks, if there are enough people who are doing that, or and if the probability is effectively of losing out on a block gets high enough, what essentially happens in that scenario is that it can actually become unprofitable for you to for you to mine if you're not paying attention to these sanctions. But the thing that we point out, though, is that that's really only possible in the short run, right? So in the short run, you could kind of you could implement this, and you could potentially have people who are mining non-compliant blocks be unprofitable. But there are a lot of things that might make this difficult in the long run for that to actually be a durable outcome. And so what those things are is, like, first of all, outside of U.S. jurisdiction, like you have no obligation to follow these things. And so if it becomes unprofitable for you to mine in the United States, maybe you just go mine somewhere else. and you just find a place outside of U.S. jurisdiction, now you don't have to worry about that. The other thing is that maybe if it's becoming costlier to mine, then you just have an incentive to look for cheaper sources of energy so that you can mine on those cheaper sources of energy to offset the higher costs of these people who are trying to rewrite blocks. So you have all of these different kind of long run incentives, right? So in economics, we typically differentiate the long run and the short run by saying, like, look, in the short run, certain things just aren't variable. Like, you can't just, so for example, if I own a massive mining operation, I can't just up and move that thing tomorrow, but I can up and move that thing like within a year's time, right? And so when we think about these things, given the sort of limitations that people face in the short run, that impact on profitability is something that you would actually worry about affecting miners and the viability of those miners. But over the long run, everything becomes variable. And when everything becomes variable, there are lots of other margins on which these miners can adjust to try to avoid the costs associated with those things. And so what you would expect to see happen is you would expect that, miners would likely, try to leave places subject to U.S. jurisdiction. You would see miners. You would see miners go not only leave those places, but go try to find places that have lower costs of electricity and things like that to offset these expected losses from rewritten blocks and things of that nature. And so and all of these things are moving people between groups, right? And so to the extent that these things move people towards like the group that's not rewriting blocks, okay, then in that case, that starts to change the profitability in and of itself, right? Because now if there just aren't a lot of people who are trying to rewrite blocks, well, then it's not that big of a risk to you and it's not really affecting your profitability. And so these adjustments that some people make are kind of self-reinforcing in terms of like reducing those costs associated with rewriting the chain.
So if I'm in Kazakhstan and I'm getting super cheap electricity and I don't really care about sanctions, so I'm not trying very hard to do anything with that, but then all of a sudden I'm losing some block rewards because someone in the U.S. has rewritten a block, why would is there any reason, economically, is there any reason I wouldn't switch over to maybe also join them to be block, do more compliance? Or is there a technical barrier? Does it take a lot of time to try to implement these kind of things? Or am I just going to be like, whatever, keep on keeping on, cheap electricity, Kazakhstan, happy?
Well, it's going to depend on how cheap the electricity is, right? So like the cheaper the electricity, at a certain level, the electricity is so cheap that the risk isn't even worth caring about. But it's just sort of as the cost of electricity is rising, there's a point at which you have to start actually caring about whether people are rewriting blocks, because now it's actually affecting the difference between you being profitable and not being profitable. And then the other thing too that we mentioned is that there's a couple other factors that are kind of unique about Bitcoin in the sense that it's true that like you couldn't necessarily mine unprofitably forever because you can't continue to spend more than what you're bringing in. But first of all, some people are not mining for profit, right? Some people, they have another income source and they're willing to pay some amount of their electricity bill just to mine, just to run their Bitcoin miner, right? And so somebody like that might not even care if it's not profitable. And somebody like that might actually be hard to punish anyway, because if they're just running it in their house or something, how is, what's the likelihood that the U.S. government's going to show up and say, hey, you're not OFAC-compliant or you're not rewriting blocks? That seems unlikely. But even miners who are mining for profit might be willing to, mine unprofitably in the short run if they affect that profits will return in sort of the longer run. And so then at that point, it sort of becomes a little bit of a game of chicken, right? Where it's like, okay, well, let's see how long you're really going to rewrite these blocks, because we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. And so then at that point, it sort of depends on, how much of the hash rate is in one group versus how much of the hash rate is in the other group, sort of who's going to win that horse race.
And just, I mean, as Josh said, there's so many different moving parts and variables here. One of them is, again, transaction fees, which are one of Bitcoin's key, censorship-resistant tools. So, just imagine a scenario where Russia wants to send $1 billion worth of Bitcoin to, some other sanctioned country. So you have sanctioned parties on both ends. And because of this feather forking strategy, they're having trouble getting their transaction into the blockchain. Well, so what are they going to do? They're going to increase the fee, and quite a bit, probably, maybe up into the millions of dollars. So then, even if just a small group of people are willing to chance getting their block rewritten, I think it's worth it for them, because the reward in the from the fees would be massive. And then another reason might just be self-preservation. You yourself might be a sanctioned country. You want to protect, your own ability to transact in Bitcoin, and so you might mine Bitcoin at a loss, even with the cheapest energy available, just so you can move funds. And so there are so many ways for the strategy to leak, in other words.
Well, another thing I would add too is like one thing that I think doesn't get enough attention when we talk about sanctions is that, in the dollar-based sanctions are implemented within a dollar-based system by the people who issue the dollar. What's different about Bitcoin is, so suppose the United States does this, right? They say, okay, we want you to not process transactions in these blocks. And not only that, we want you to rewrite blocks that include those transactions, all that kind of stuff. What's to stop China from instructing people to do the same thing? What's to stop Russia from instructing people to do the same thing? What's to stop France, Germany, anyone, right? Like any government could just decide, hey, we want to implement sanctions on Bitcoin also, right? And so when you think about it that way, then this is going to be very different. Also, the other thing too is because these governments. So if you're the Russian government, say, and you're subject to these sanctions on Bitcoin, one of the things that you could do is you could actually just start subsidizing Bitcoin mining in Russia, right? Mm-hmm. Just send money to Bitcoin miners in Russia, and so now the government is effectively paying part of your costs. And so now you don't care if people rewrite the blocks because you're getting all of this money from the government to go ahead and mine these things. And so the thing that makes Bitcoin much more complicated is that there is no central control. And so even though people not only can imagine, but have imagined how they would try to implement sanctions like we have in the United States on Bitcoin, one thing that they're ignoring is the fact that like no one controls the Bitcoin network. And so even if you could implement these things and even if you could have some level of success, there are just so many other ways that other people could respond to this in ways that just don't work for, the traditional financial system. And so there are ways that, adversaries could do the exact same thing back to you. And so that puts you in an entirely different sort of game theory. And so that then raises questions about, okay, what is the actual thing? Like, even if you are concerned, and even if you think that sanctions are good, like what should you actually do? Because the game theory gets very, very different when, your adversaries start subsidizing Bitcoin miners because you're sanctioning their transactions and all that kind of stuff, right? Like there are so many moving parts that it becomes very, very difficult to even figure out what the optimal strategy is, even if you take for granted that they're going to do some type of sanction-based policy. Like, well, what becomes optimal for them in that sort of scenario, because all of these other margins change.
So, and I think we're coming back to, again, maybe technically feasible isn't the right word, but it could happen. but ineffective, right? So in the kind of longer term, it doesn't sound like the feather forking is really something that is like Bitcoin is resistant to that. It has a lot of resilience. So you mentioned maybe keeping all of these things in mind in your paper about rather than trying to do these sanctions through Bitcoin, that the U.S. government should focus on retaining the domestic mining industry and capacity, and also, not only maintaining it, but don't over-regulate it. So maybe you want to talk about why that is strategically important for us.
Well, during the Biden administration, we saw the proposed DAME tax, which was a kind of 30% excise tax on domestic miners in the U.S. That would have hobbled the mining industry, basically put them out of business because the margins, through for the most part, aren't that great as far as I understand it. So I think that would be detrimental to not only the mining industry in the U.S. economy, but also we want to preserve the ability of our citizens to transact with Bitcoin, and we want to protect ourselves against things like feather forking chain compliance strategies from China and Russia and so on. So insofar as we don't have a healthy domestic Bitcoin mining industry, we are ourselves susceptible to this kind of feather fork attack. So for that reason, I think you want a healthy, vibrant domestic mining industry, not only for the benefits that accrue to the economy, but also as a point of self-preservation.
Josh, anything you want to add to that?
I just think this kind of reframes sort of the strategy, right? Like, so the reason the United States uses these sanctions is because they control the dollar and they have jurisdiction over all of these payment rails. But even if they're interested in sanctions, or even if they're interested in using Bitcoin like as some kind of tool to, adversely affect their enemies, there's an alternative strategy here, and that alternative strategy is actually just embrace Bitcoin mining and the freedom of Bitcoin mining. Because if you do that, some of the people who are going to be up against your authoritarian adversaries are going to be dissidents, and those dissidents are going to be using Bitcoin. And so by actually just helping these transactions process, you might be able to help, dissidents, journalists, people like that in these foreign countries who are sort of undermining the adversarial regime. And so actually the best strategy might be to encourage mining here so that you have so that you can prevent other countries from doing a sort of feather fork strategy. But then at the same time, that having that mining capacity helps you to then support these dissidents and journalists and things like that are in these adversarial countries, and help them to succeed in their efforts.
Yeah, so that's one of the beautiful things about Bitcoin. It exports freedom elsewhere, and it helps undermine the very sort of authoritarians that we would want to sanction anyway.
And it's a nice open source ledger, right? So you can see it's very transparent about what's going on, and we have a lot of technology now to track illicit activities, right? And right. See what's happening. So any other closing thoughts before we wrap?
Yeah, well, just to riff on your last point, Renee, I think that's important because, if I imagine myself as an OFAC official, I think, oh no, like my job is impossible now. What am I supposed to do? Like Bitcoin is the enemy. And while I, as a Bitcoin researcher and as someone in favor of the First Amendment and privacy and so on, whereas I wish that Bitcoin were were or had been more private, it does have a public and permanent ledger. And this presents opportunities for international law enforcement to track wrongdoers, to collect information about where they're sending money, where they get it from, when, and to use this in cases against people that we would want to sanction anyway. So I think it just shifts the burden from blocking transactions to surveilling them.
I think that's a very good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the important point here, and I think kind of like the motivation for doing this kind of work, is that no matter how positive that states get regarding Bitcoin, states act in their own interest. And so it's worthwhile to think about, what states are likely to do and how states are likely to try to exploit Bitcoin for their purposes, right? Like, so given that Bitcoin exists, given where Bitcoin is now, right? Like, given the sort of saliency of Bitcoin in like just people's minds around the world, it stands to reason that yes, you might see people embrace it, but you also might see people try to figure out ways to use it to their advantage. And so part of the point of doing stuff like this is to actually think carefully about whether or not the things that people try to do, whether we like the things that they're going to try to do or not, could succeed, and under what conditions that they could succeed. Because honestly, that's one of the great things about sort of the Bitcoin space, is that, you'll hear lots of Bitcoiners just say like everything is an attack on Bitcoin. Right. And, but the thing is though, is that mentality is kind of a good mentality to have, because it forces you to think very carefully about how the system works, about how, how people might try to exploit it. What are the attack surfaces that people might try to use, and then to think very carefully about whether those things, whether the things that people try to do to their own advantage, especially if those things are things that are going to bring costs to you or others. It's really important to figure out, is this feasible? Like, is this possible? Is this something that they could actually do? And how might people respond? And also just sort of thinking about it, like, the other thing about that attitude that like, oh, everything is an attack on Bitcoin, is that everything that attacks Bitcoin that doesn't kill Bitcoin essentially teaches us something about how Bitcoin functions. And in some sense makes Bitcoin stronger, right? Because people have more confidence that, okay, this is really what people say that it is. And so with this paper, everything is about, we're really digging into something that a lot of Bitcoiners hold dear, which is this idea that Bitcoin is censorship resistant. And so kind of what we're doing is saying, okay, look, the United States government might come along and say, hey, we're the king of censorship of financial transactions, and we are here to implement that on Bitcoin. And what would that look like? And would it be possible? And so that is an actual way to put censorship resistance to the test. And so I think we have to take that seriously. And if we, given that that's something that we value about Bitcoin, is its censorship resistance, we owe it to ourselves to figure out, what the threats to that actually are, and to what extent those threats have any chance of being successful.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for writing a paper looking into this, and for speaking with me today and going over it, and also at our summit as well. So thanks to both of you, and hope to see the next paper coming out soon.
Thank you, Renee.
Thank you.